So yeah, let's just get into talking about the book. And one of my favorite things about the book, and that I also feel very simpatico with, is the fact that you are defending this value, the value of equality, that has really kind of fallen out of vogue to defend in feminist and anti-racist circles to some degree. So I just wanted to hear you say a little bit about like why now is the time to be writing a book about equality, and yeah, what in the world makes this the moment to be talking about this particular value?
Okay, so thanks very much, Serene. And I'm someone who's always kind of felt that inequality are the crucial things, and maybe we can talk a bit later about what difference it makes whether one starts from equality or from inequality. But I think what a lot of what the book arises from is this distrust of a kind of comforting story that people often tell themselves about the progress of equality, and the idea that we live in a world where we've abandoned notions of a kind of natural hierarchy where there's supposedly now kind of wide agreement that, we all think that human beings are in some important sense equal. This is part of why it's fallen out of vogue, of course, within feminism, is the oddity of that belief. And I guess I'm of a generation that perhaps has been particularly prone to believe that happy story, because the 20th century was one in which it seemed as though in many countries we were seeing a kind of movement in a right direction as regards equality. So it was a period in which governments were more willing to tax the rich, incomes for lower and middle income people rising, governments spending more on kind of welfare, universal health, universal education. 20th century is also the period in which people stop talking about the rights of man and start talking about human rights, feminist mobilizations challenging patriarchy, civil rights, anti-racist, anti-colonial politics challenging racism and imperialism. So you can see it's a kind of, it was a century that generated this sense that however unequal things were, one might be broadly on the right kind of path towards a kind of a more egalitarian society. That seems so far from true. But in my case, rather than thinking about, well, there's something about this notion of equality that we should just drop, I think we need to think very differently about what the history of equality has been and what that tells us about the problems in some of the ways it's formulated. I mean, in the philosophical literature, I don't think a lot of the philosophical work on equality hasn't been fantastically helpful in my view. I think there are broadly two camps of thinking in the philosophical literature. There's the work that's broadly in relation to what Amartya Sen and others have called equality of what. So that tends to kind of take it as given that we all care about equality in some sense, but focuses attention on, so what kind of equality? Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equality of outcome, welfare, resources, capabilities, all kinds of candidates? One problem with the literature is that it leaves you feeling equality is an incredibly complicated idea, but the main problem that increasingly strikes me about it is that it seems to take it as a starting point that we do all actually share this view of basic equality, which, just looking around the world, you don't have to look around your world, you just have to look around your own country. The ways in which we operate so many hierarchies of kind of inferior and superior on a basis of class, education, skin color, gender, you name it. We're a very long way from that. And then the other kind of school of thinking in philosophy, it does start from basic equality, does deal with basic equality, but then it focuses on the question of, so why? Why should we think of people as equals? Why should we think of human beings as equals? And then that's the kind of tradition that goes into very much searching for this property, this quality that will somehow justify treating people as equals. So, you know, and historically, it's so clear how that's worked to exclude people. So rationality, people talk about rationality as what characterizes humans. Oh, but somehow it doesn't characterize women. Or sort of notions of animality used to justify the enslavement of Africans, or notions of the distinctions between those humans who are civilized and those who are not yet, or even can't ever be civilized, used to justify colonialism. So that the kind of the many ways in which the properties attached to the human, or the notion of what the human is, actually turns out to be incredibly exclusionary. So it's increasingly, it's seemed to me that there's something about the way in which we've fallen into thinking of equality as attached to conditions that is what makes it so problematic. And that if we could kind of just definitively free ourselves of that and see equality as the political commitment that we make to one another, then that to me is the way forward.
Yeah. One of the things that you've already gestured at in this answer that I would love for you to talk a little bit more with the audience about is what some of these, like the content of what some of these historical justifications of denying equality to people have been. And I think I say this in my blurb about the book, but I also want the audience to know, like, if you're looking for something to teach or read that really, it doesn't just kind of mention offhandedly equality has been used as a justification for practices like colonialism and slavery. Like, this is a book that has a really excellent and rich chapter that details how specific arguments that we get taught were egalitarian arguments were in fact often used to establish that some people really were not within the like community of equals. So, Anne, I was just wondering if you could give the audience a couple of examples of historical arguments that we are taught are egalitarian, but actually ended up justifying inequality.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd say the typical kind of story that you get in Europe and America about the way in which modern ideas of equality come into existence. There's very much an idea that round about the 17th century, people start talking about us as natural equals. And it kind of comes in the form of stories about what would we be like in a state of nature if there were no developed society or no systems of government, no regulation. You know, actually, there wouldn't be much to choose between us. There'd be no natural hierarchy. Kind of sounds quite good, but you actually look at what any of the kind of the leading figures of that 16th, 17th century type argument came up with. They don't actually see it as actually having any implications in terms of how one should actually treat or regard human beings. 18th century, you get a kind of what looks like a more promising version of that. So you get the American Declaration of Independence, you get the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's the rights of man, of course, but still you get this idea that it's not just that we are, you know, born naturally equal, but actually you get this notion of born and remaining free and equal. So this looks like it's kind of, this is really something, this is really assertion. But the people who are born free and equal, I mean, they are men, they're not women. And that's very clear from all the legislation that is passed during the 18th and 19th century. They're white men, not black men. They don't include the poor, they don't include the dispossessed. And if you kind of go through the writings about the ways in which some of our heroes of the kind of that, you know, liberal, early egalitarian thinking, it's to me, it's just astonishing. I mean, what did they think they were talking about when they talked about equality? That they could think of, that they could use this notion, but actually refer to a minuscule proportion of the human beings in the world, and trying to understand the kind of conditionality that went into their notions of equality that allowed them in a way, not even to notice very often how much they had excluded. I mean, it's not just the kind of the people, deliberately saying, and I don't mean by this, those people over there who are kind of, beyond the pale. It's kind of just the extent to which the lack of perception that this idea of equality, if it means anything, must surely mean all of us, but that's not the way it's understood.
I want to ask you about that. Like, do you think that they really didn't notice? Because one of the things that I also see in your work that I really like is you're talking about the fact that they do often go to great argumentative lengths to explain why they're excluding this group of people. So it's almost like, is it letting them off the hook too easily to say that they couldn't notice that people besides?
Yeah. I'm definitely not saying that they couldn't notice. And I think this is one of the ways in which people get let off the hook. There's a kind of notion that, well, of course, in those days, how could anyone think that women could be the equals of men? How could anyone think that Native Americans could be the equals of the white Europeans who came and took over the lands? There's a line of argument which says, well, people were just so constrained by their time and the prejudices of their time. But actually, right from the moment in which people are talking about equality, there are some people who are saying, hang on, if you say this, you've got to mean women as well as men. Or if you say this, you can't deny that it also applies to the people that you want to enslave. So I agree, it's not that it's impossible to imagine. But I do think that among the various strange sets of arguments that people pursue, there's a combination of people constructing a human norm which is very much in the image of themselves and therefore excludes the majority of human beings. But I think there's also people who just see this image of the human norm and simply don't perceive that there are all these other people that are also human. So I do think that there are both going on, but I completely agree with you about the idea that you could somehow say, well, this is just unfortunate lapses of history that, they couldn't imagine the way we could imagine that these ideas could be applied more widely. That seems to me a very, very much letting people off the hook and not really engaging with the seriousness of the particular ways in which equality got constructed in that history. And then what, of course, particularly bothers me, what the legacy of that is for some of the ways in which equality continues to be thought about today.
Yeah, I think you're right that both of the things are going on, right? We have some people who just seem unable to ideologically escape a certain representation of the human, but something that I really like in this book is that you point out some very specific arguments that people are making that allow them in their minds to retain the idea that it is logically consistent to claim that people are equal and to have no political equality. So I think you just brought one of them up, that distinction between natural and political equality. Like people, at least in the view that you describe, a lot of philosophers seem to have thought it was perfectly consistent to hold that people would be equal in strength in the state of nature, but that would have no implications about how we ought to be treated politically. So yeah, I just wanted to flag that's one of.
But I just also think that what comes out of it is this the ambiguity of nature, because we know how the natural equals. That sounds great. You're appealing to nature to justify equality. But as soon as you put nature in the picture, you know this from feminism, you know this from the whole history of kind of race, that, the kind of nature becomes the justification for all kinds of gradations and exclusions, so that people are represented as naturally incapable of being able to be equals, or as kind of, naturally sort of a natural binary between the sexes, or, a natural hierarchy organized in kind of racialized categories. So nature plays this very strange role that at the one hand, it seems to offer this notion of something that, you know, just the nature of being human. But as soon as you put nature in the picture, it becomes this very kind of problematic way of fixing people in certain categories that they then aren't allowed to escape from.
Yeah, that makes me want to ask a question that I'm kind of coming up with on the fly. So it's maybe a little bit partly baked. But one thing that Anne argues in, not so much in the book, but in a recent article about gender and modernity, is that one of the mistakes that we can make as readers of the history of political thought and the history of like liberatory political ideals is that we can think that the only way that these ideals could have been interpreted is in liberatory ways. So if somebody said that all men were equal in the 1700s, then obviously what was going to have to come from that ultimately was gender equality. And Anne kind of says in this article, no, these ideas always were available to multiple interpretations. And what actually made them end up liberatory in some cases was actual political movements and political contestation, right? Like political movements saying, this is the way we ought to interpret equality, regardless of whether the writer of the text intended it in that way. So I'm wondering, one, if you could talk a little bit more about that, but I'm also wondering whether you think of this teleological thing as a symptom of also our inability to deal with the ambiguity of nature. Like if we feel if part of what we want from a concept is like the idea that there's only one way it could unfold.
No, that, I think that's very interesting. I think this idea that there's a kind of logic to equality that kind of, you know, eventually finds its way through, it simply doesn't recognize enough the importance of politics. Actually, I feel a bit of a fraud being on a kind of podcast which is run by the Philosopher, because in many ways, part of what I'm trying to argue is that equality is political, right? It's a politics that we make happen. It's a politics that comes about when we make a commitment to one another to regard one another as equals, or when we make a claim to people who have denied us equality or who've treated us as inferiors. It's a kind of political thing that we make happen rather than a philosophical argument. So I think the philosophical arguments tend to kind of encourage this kind of notion of what's inherent in an idea and the way in which it will lead in a particular, hopefully, you know, progressive direction. Whereas once you think of equality much more as the kind of the politics, of course, you know, things go backwards and things go forward. There is no guarantee. So the kind of what I started from, which was the idea of that 20th century period of optimism that things were moving in the right direction, almost like there was a ratchet effect. I think I did used to think this, that there was a kind of ratchet effect, that the movement towards equality might stop, but it would never go back. I now think that's hugely over-optimistic. If once you recognize the kind of the politics that is central to equality, it becomes something that one has to kind of constantly commit oneself to, constantly claim, rather than imagining that there is this kind of like somehow trajectory which, you know, history will eventually stops and starts deliver us from.
Do you want to, because this was also kind of on my list of questions, do you want to give the audience some examples of cases where we've seen regress in terms of equality in our political world and not just kind of a stopping in our tracks?
Well, I think undoubtedly we're seeing regress in terms of material equality. I mean, we see that very dramatically in my own country in terms of, you know, the gap between rich and poor that closed and now has opened up again. I think we see, it's astonishing to me how much people are now willing to entertain ways of thinking about democracy in which one would begin to go back to an idea that it was a big mistake to think that all individuals should simply be have you know, an equal vote and equal say, because after all, it's quite clear that some people are hugely more informed about politics than others. So you get people like, Jason Brennan writing a book against democracy, which suggests that we should reintroduce some kind of voter test in order to qualify for the right to vote. But you don't have to have philosophers writing that. It seems to me that it increasingly becomes part of the language in which people talk, you know, so that, I mean, I think one might have thought we've reached the point where the principle of democracy, just at its simplest level, just one person, one vote, it is so far established that that's one thing that's not going to go. But it seems to me that that's challenged quite a lot.
Well, and certainly like recent situations surrounding electoral politics in the United States make that really clear too, right? I know I'm mostly talking to an audience in the UK and Europe, but I mean, it's clear here that one of the major political parties now knows that it can't win by espousing that principle of one person.
So it needs to remove votes from people.
Yeah, exactly.
Remove the chance of voting. Yeah. So,
also, I think, I mean, it seems clear in at least certain areas of gender equality that we're seeing lots of regress. Like there are certainly areas where there's progress too, but it's hard watching like reproductive rights be stripped away. I mean, at least for somebody kind of my generation, I was certainly born with more reproductive rights than I have now, which is not something, you know, I would have ever expected to have in my lifetime, the way that equality had been taught to me kind of growing up in school. Okay, so I feel like we're talking a lot about the negative side, but I actually think that one of the most important things about the book is that it helps us tackle that. So I wanted to ask you about one more historical argument before we get more to the meat of your argument. Would you just talk a little bit more about Las Casas and Sylvia Wynter's interpretation of him? Because the story you tell there about colonialism and genocide of Indigenous people and the way that ideas actually, that we often think are liberatory, actually played a role in perpetuating them, I think is a really interesting story that people would love to learn about.
Okay, so this is around the time of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, when legitimized by the Pope, Spain kind of goes into the Americas and claims land and claims the right to kind of clear the land, to move the indigenous peoples out of their villages, to, you know, make them into forced labor, and so on and so forth. And then you have, because this is Spain, and it's still very much working within a kind of religious framework, there's this big debate which is set up by, it's almost like the Spanish crown sets up this kind of commission to see, is it legitimate what we're doing there? Can it be religiously justified? And there's this big debate in which you have Bartolomé de las Casas, who is a Dominican who had become very much a defender of the indigenous peoples, and had written a great deal in relation to them, in debate with Juan Gines Sepulveda, who basically had this kind of image of, he talked about, you know, basically they're so much lesser than us. They're like monkeys to our men, you know, so that he appeals to nature, a natural difference, to justify effectively turning the Indians into forced labor. What I found really interesting about, I mean, one of the ways of thinking about that is to see de las Casas as the beginning of human rights type talk, because he defends the rights of the local inhabitants. He challenges the idea that somehow they are, you know, because of their different religious and cultural beliefs, that somehow they're lesser He's represented as a kind of early figure in the development of human rights. And what Sylvia Wynter, who's this really interesting Jamaican novelist and critic, does in her interpretation of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, is that she gets you to see that it's Sepúlveda, with his emphasis on natural difference, that is actually the voice of modern equality. So that De las Casas comes over as almost like the last gasp of a kind of more religious way of seeing the world, in which the distinctions you made between people were to do with could they or could they not be brought to God, and anyone who could be brought to God, you know, was as good as anyone else who could be brought to God. Whereas Sepúlveda is arguing this: there are differences between us, and there are these people and those people, and there are barbarians who just will never reach the level of the civilized. And what I found really, really helpful about her work was that, I mean, she sees this period as the period in which you're getting the construction of this new human norm, which is in which, the way she describes it, the kind of, you know, the male white European is overrepresented. And that becomes the kind of the notion of what humanity is. And it's defined, again, to come back to this idea about the importance of nature in the way in which equality was skewed, it becomes very much defined by this notion of the kind of the natural differences, which disqualify vast quantities of human beings from ever being considered as possible, possibly, you know, agents of equality. So right. I agree. I think it's a fascinating moment.
And just for the audience, I think one tidbit that you mentioned that's particularly dark, tell me if this is right, is that there was a period in which, in order to justify enslaving Indigenous peoples, one had to, like, pro forma ask them if they accepted Jesus Christ as their God, and then when they said no, then or they said nothing, then that was the moment of acceptability before the shift into the idea of a natural hierarchy among humans.
I mean, it's an extraordinary moment in which the kind of the bowing to religion and notions of kind of legalism meant that you know, at any point at which the Spanish colonists wanted to take over an area, they had to read this document, the requerimiento, which basically basically announced to the villagers that the Pope had granted this land to the Spanish, and that they needed to make their obeisance to the King and Queen of Spain, and they needed to accept the Holy Fathers and their teachings about Christianity, and that if they didn't respond to this, then it was then the colonists were perfectly entitled to just basically take them over, burn their villages and so on. And they would read this document like 5 miles from the village in the middle of the night, and anyway in a language that the inhabitants couldn't hear. But they'd done what was necessary to legitimate and to justify what they were doing. So there was this curious kind of bowing to the requirement to perform certain kind of, religiously legitimated, legal requirement, but in a way that was just so cynical that you can hardly believe it.
Yeah. So before we start going to the Q&A, I do want us to take some time to talk about the positive argument of your book. So one of the things, like the central things that you say, is that we should stop trying to give a justification of the equality of persons or humans or something like that. Can you say a little bit more about that argument and why you think we should stop offering justifications?
Yeah. I think if you get into the game of having to prove that you are as good as anyone else, or that you are as entitled as anyone else to be equal. I mean, imagine trying to prove that women should be regarded as the equals of men because they're just as rational as men, or their brains are just as big as men's, or they're just as strong as men. I mean, you know, if you get into that kind of game, if you get into those kinds of arguments, in effect, you are accepting that if your evidence, your proof fails, then you're willing to agree that, oh, actually, you're probably quite right. We are not to be regarded as equals. That is, as soon as you kind of set up this justification, you're setting up a test. You're saying the reason why I will regard you as an equal is because you have this quality. Well, say you don't have this quality. What happens then? Actually, there's just this kind of bit of a detour. So in the UK at the moment, there's been a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about Emma Raducanu, who recently won the women's title at the US Open. So very, very talented tennis player. But also, particularly for those of us who, you know, who are keen to challenge the anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism talk that is kind of, you know, quite widely shared in across Europe at the moment. It's a great story because she's an immigrant. She was born in Canada. She and her family moved to the UK when she was 2 years old. Her mother's Chinese, her father's Romanian. So she's a great poster girl, as well as being a great tennis player. She's a great poster girl for immigration, multiculturalism. But I read a really good comment from a woman who's the head of the Equality Trust, which is a sort of London-based organization that sort of promotes social and economic equality, which I think captures a lot of what I'm thinking. So, and she said, well, yes, of course we should celebrate her great talent and her achievement, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to slide into somehow a celebration of immigrants and immigration because of the amazing things that people bring to society, or their amazing talents or their amazing achievements, that we should be, that, you know, what's important about immigrants or refugees is that they're human beings, right? So that it shouldn't be predicated on the amazing things that they can do. It shouldn't be conditional on the qualities that they have. It should be nothing more than just the common sense fact that people are human beings. And I think, you know, we don't officially make it predicated on people's, you know, gender or racial or, you know, religious characteristics in most countries of the world. But you know, the idea that somehow the conditionality attached to your intellectual or your physical or your moral qualities, I think absolutely continues. And that's, or another example, the UK, well, this is true, the US even more so, if you're a convicted criminal, you lose the right to vote. I mean, in the case of the UK, you just lose the right to vote while you're actually in prison, but you do lose the right to vote. Now, the right to vote we think of as a kind of one of the most basic rights that it represents something about the belief in equality. But it's like saying, you know, it's not good enough just to be a human being in order to qualify for this. You have to be a good human being. And if you've been a bad human being, if you've kind of fallen short of some kind of moral norm, then you lose even this basic right, like the right to vote. And as we know in parts of America, not just while you're a convicted prisoner, but actually after you've served your sentence as well. So it's like, I think it's still the case, both in the ways in which people think about equals, but also in the legislation of many countries that regard themselves as egalitarian, that these conditions are still very much kind of practiced as part of, it's just being human is never enough. There's always these extra things that you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I love that argument. One kind of quick tension though that kind of came out in how you were talking about the book at the beginning is you mentioned at the beginning that there's this problem with assuming that everybody already believes in equality. And of course, in a US context, it's especially I mean, hard to start from the assumption that everybody believes in equality, especially when, I mean, when you brought up the tennis example, right? I think to the extent that Americans believe in equality, they tend to believe everyone should have an equal opportunity to be excellent. And then if you're excellent, you should reap the rewards of the excellence. Yeah. But yeah, I'm just curious, and then this will be the last question before the Q&A, like, if we don't try to justify equality, what do we do about the very real fact of equality deniers? Like the more subtle types I just described, but also, I mean, in an era of like the ascendance of the radical right and people now online and in public making geneticist arguments about the inferiority of some groups of people becoming emboldened, like, where does unconditional equals leave us with regard to that?
I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying that we never make any arguments for you know, why you should regard others that at the moment you don't think of as your equals, and actually, but I think we pull on a whole armory of possible arguments. Some of them we throw back to people and say, so tell me what's the basis on which you think that this category of people somehow are of lesser significance and worth than you. Give me your justification for that. Some of what we do is to, in a sense, dramatize the sense in which the people that you are treating as not your equals actually are so like you in so many ways. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't engage in those kinds of arguments. I think they're often very kind of powerful, you know, when you kind of, you know, you just get people to think about the similarities across differences. But I think it's important, even in making those arguments, that you're not saying, and it's because this person X has this particular characteristic or property or quality Y, that's why you should regard this person as an equal. I think there are lots of arguments that we draw on, and I don't rule any of them out. But I just think that when one finds oneself trying to make a proof which depends on demonstrating some kind of property, you know, some kind of human characteristic that everyone has, you're on a hiding to nothing, really, because there are always going to be people who don't fit that particular human norm, because every human norm is going to be, you know, specific and particular in some kind of way. But you know, of course we argue and we draw on whatever we can, whatever we can lay our hands on in order to make arguments. But I really do think that it's not a matter of saying the justification for regarding others as equals is because all humans are capable of a sense of justice. That was John Rawls, or because all humans have the power of reason, or all of these candidates that have been offered over the years and over the centuries.
And that's really interesting.
Deeply problematic, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's what you're suggesting is a different way of thinking about the role that the arguments play and the purpose of the questioning. The purpose of asking ourselves questions about how we're similar to others and deserve similar things to them. So to go to the question and answer, there's actually several questions on here that kind of speak directly to this point. A couple of different people are asking but don't we, the question I think is boiling down to from about 3 different people, don't we need some kind of criteria to tell who is eligible for equality and who is not?
Okay, so the only criterion that seems to me to be, to make sense is that we are human, right? And I think it's a very common sense notion about what it means to be human. I mean, I find it very, I think it's conceivable that there were periods in history in which travelers to distant lands came across people and they weren't really quite sure whether these people were human. I can accept that that's a kind of historic possibility, right? But there is no way that we don't know who and what is a human, right? I mean, you know, it's kind of, it's just so obvious. What happens is that people impose on that all kinds of gradations and distinctions between lesser and greater humans. So the only criterion that seems to me to be relevant in terms of thinking about equality is, are you a human or not? I mean, one of the things that exposes me to, and it's kind of one of the criticisms that I get, is that it means that I'm making what seems like quite a sharp distinction between humans and non-human animals, which is...
That's coming up in the
right.
chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also somebody brings up aliens too, which maybe is an interesting analogy to the traveling to other lands thing. Yeah. So what do you think about this?
Okay. So first of all, I think that I think responsibilities that we have to non-human animals are really not best thought of in terms of the language of equals, right? I mean, I think we have enormous responsibilities to non-human animals, and I think we betray those responsibilities in many, many ways, in the ways in which we currently live our lives. But I don't think that the language of equals is the way to think about that. And also, it's kind of, it would be rather kind of odd to me to say, oh well, we ought to behave differently to non-human animals because they share so many characteristics with us humans that they ought to be entitled to different kinds of treatments. And you think, well, why do they have to be like humans in order to justify being treated in a better way? They don't have to be like humans. They can be non-human animals, and that's, you know, and that carries various kinds of obligations and responsibilities anyway. So, aliens, well, I mean, I think one has to kind of, I guess, keep an open mind about a kind of a world in which you come into contact with beings who aren't human beings, who for whom you also have certain kinds of responsibilities and obligations, and you don't just go around and shoot them all, right? Just because they're you know, they are not humans. But I think the idea, it seems to me that equality is something which has proved very specific to the things that we think about human societies, and it doesn't seem to me that it's the value that is most illuminating in trying to think about our responsibilities, certainly to non-human animals. I've done less kind of careful thinking about how we should deal with aliens. So I'm probably not going to give a very helpful answer to that one.
So on this animal topic, I'm going to read one question from
Yeah.
Carolina, because it's maybe a development of your thought that equality might not be the right value for considering the moral considerability of animals. So Carolina says, dignity is an idea that locates close to equality. In recent times, people are starting to talk about all sorts of challenging ways to the idea of dignity and equality. One of them is that nature has dignity. Professor Phillips, how would you envision the dignity of nature? We live in a time of deep challenges and ethical transitions. Do you think that equality and dignity would be a good platform to the legal paradigm of the rights of nature?
Generally, no. Personally, I don't find dignity very helpful, right? I mean, I think when it comes to humans, when people say the reason you have human rights is because, like all humans, you have human dignity, or the reason you should be treated as an equal is because, like other humans, you have human dignity. And I just don't know what is added by the term dignity to the commitment to treating others as equals. And if something is being added, then I get a bit worried that something is being added that might turn out to be a reason for saying that some humans actually somehow fail this kind of this criterion of dignity. So I don't find dignity a useful way to think about human equality. And so by extension, it doesn't really seem to me particularly the best way to think about, I don't know, I think you can think about what's awesome about nature. I mean, that seems a term that has some kind of meaning when you talk about nature, the kind of the force of the waves, the kind of there's something kind of extraordinary, the kind of the sort of the natural forces that are not humanly created. There's all kinds of language that you can employ to that. But for me, dignity, I mean, what's it trying to do? It seems to me it's trying to kind of attribute something that people have attributed to humans to nature, and so by extension to commit us to certain kinds of ways of relating to nature. And I just think we can just go straight there. We can just go straight to committing ourselves to certain ways of relating to nature without having to dress it up, in my view, with what I just don't find helpful, the language of dignity. I don't find it helpful in relation to thinking about human equality. I don't find it helpful in relation to thinking about nature. But notions of awesome, I mean, there are all kinds of things you can say about nature which are different from what you would say about human beings, for sure.
That makes me want to ask you a lot of questions about dignity, but I want to do justice to the Q&A.
Yeah.
So there's another kind of cluster of questions here about what are the political implications of being unconditional equals? Like, how do we practice that as a set of policies and politics?
Okay, right. So I think one very important pressing implication is that people do not lose their status as equals when they behave badly. And I think this is a very kind of big thing that has kind of hugely slipped in contemporary thinking. So you think about the ways in which, say, after 9/11, so many people toyed with the idea that torture was okay, right? Toyed with the idea that there could be people who were such bad people that somehow even the notion that you do not torture people loses its power, right? My example about convicted prisoners losing their voting rights would be another example of this. So there are one of the things that if you think about us as unconditional equals, you do not allow those moral differentiations to justify stripping away people's human rights. I mean, that would be one very big thing that goes on at the moment, I think, is that moral turpitude in some way gets used as a way of eliminating or reducing people's human rights. So that would be one very big difference between an unconditional equality. It doesn't mean that we don't have any kind of sense of some people being, hugely better than others in lots of kinds of ways, but it's that in terms of the sense in which, as humans, we are of equal significance, that we should never let go of. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think actually a lot of people were asking about that. Yeah. There's another piece to the question that I'm seeing a couple places in the chat about if certain kinds of economic policies are required. So in particular, people are asking about whether unconditional equals implies that we should have equality of outcome economically. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, personally, I do think so, though I know that that's kind of pretty controversial. I mean, I've always thought that in order to give real meaning to the idea of us as equals, there are certain material conditions that go along with that. And I think part of what's happening at the moment, part of the erosion of the belief in basic equality is linked to the increasing material inequalities within our societies, which mean that we live increasingly segregated lives in which the rich are able to insulate themselves from contact with the poor. The poor become almost like an alien species, not really humans anymore. So I think there are very important connections between the extent to which a society exists with kind of very considerable material inequalities and the capacity of us to actually think of others as our equals. So I think they are hugely connected. I don't think you have to have a world in which everyone has exactly the same distribution of resources in order to be able to think of everyone as an equal, right? I don't think that's a necessary condition, though it might be desirable. But I do think that too much material inequality erodes the capacity to see others as your equals. And I think we're seeing that all over the world at the moment, the sense in which those two feed on one another, material inequality and inability to see others as equals, or to think that their lives are equally significant or matter, or
Well, that definitely sounds right to me. There's also a question on here kind of about the potential dark sides of equality. So Chris asked, I moved on my chat, now I have to find it back. Is there a profound difference between the European practice of slavery versus the practice of colonization in the rest of history? And actually, I think I didn't realize that this was two separate questions. I actually mean the second question. So sorry. So the next question is, equality as so loosely defined and used, is it even a net positive social good when it's enforced top down across an entire society, as in the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China? So I think this person is asking in the second question, like, is there a danger in talking about equality too vaguely, also, as we, the author thinks, have seen in societies like the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China?
Yeah, well, actually, I can see we're running out of time, but one of the things I really wanted to talk about, particularly given your writings about this issue, are the ways in which, if you have too singular a notion of what living as equals means, then it can become a way in which one, in a sense, preaches to others how they ought to be living their lives. And I think your work on decolonizing universalism is a really kind of major contribution to thinking about, how we can, in your language, how we can challenge oppression, in ways that don't draw us into a kind of like thinking or imposing a singular vision of what the way people ought to live and what ought to be a kind of life lived as equal. So I think that maybe touches a little bit on what's implied in that question about a top-down society, which is certainly not what I have in mind. And I would have loved to have longer time to discuss that with you, because I think your ideas about this are really interesting.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And it occurs to me that even in the question, right, the idea of top-down equality, like, to what extent is that really understandable as an expression of equality to begin with?
Yeah.
But Anne, let's give you the last minute. What do you want? What do you want the audience to take away that we haven't touched on so far?
Well, I don't know. I think just to hold on to that kind of sense that we need to take the dangers of the history seriously, and what that tells us about the tendency to link equality to conditions. But we need to if you think of equality much more in terms of a political commitment and a political claim, it also means that it's something that we can make happen, right? It becomes something that we're able to contribute to. And so one of my former students, hearing me talk about this, said that he felt that my thinking about equality was considerably darker now than it used to be. And I think he was right, that I've kind of finally let go of my kind of progressivist fantasies about the upwards trajectory. But that does not mean that, that we cannot construct a society in which we live as equals.